All right, good morning. Is this on? You guys can hear me okay? Wonderful. Well, as promised, this is the week of the adult Bible class where you had to bring your thinking A game. We're going to be looking at a couple of concepts that come out of what we call the Dark Ages, which weren't so dark. Those guys were not dim or dull. They just didn't have Netflix, so they thought about things a lot instead of just being amused. So we're going to be, once again, looking at how do we defend our faith. And I changed the quote here to the quote that inspired the first thing we're going to be talking, the Psalm 12. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. And we have added a few topics from 14 to 22 weeks now in this course, just based on feedback and questions I had for people. And then based on this week, we may take a pause in the middle of this and talk about what is Islam, what is that religion all about, what do they believe, how did we get to Islamic fundamentalism, what's the way, the mindset of people that are in that Islamic fundamentalism, where did that come from? Which, if I were to guess off the top of my head, that would probably be 8 to 10 hours worth of teaching material that we would have to do to really do it justice, and probably 16 to 20 hours if we wanted to, dig even deeper to it. But haven't made that decision yet. I think we're going to stay on what we've got. All of this has stayed the same. We're on week 5, presuppositional arguments for the existence of God. Next week, we're going to say, hey, all of these things we've talked about, all the arguments we've had, teleological, cosmological, the religious experience, all of those things, and the topics from today, the presuppositional arguments, we'll explain what that means in a little bit. What is the best answer, the best explanation for all of those things that we see and know? That best answer is the God described in the Bible. And then we're going to say, if God in the Bible really is the best answer and Jesus claims to be God, how can that be true? That's a huge sticking point in especially the Muslim community. They do not believe that Jesus is divine. They believe he is solely a human being out of the result of a physical union between Mary and God the Father, that as we would call him, and that he was just a prophet. And then we'll talk about the Trinity. Christians are often accused of being polytheists, right? More than one God. But we don't believe in more than one God. We believe in one God. And the definitive statement for that came out of a council in 451 AD, the Council of Chalcedon, often called the Chalcedonian formula. But we'll talk about that more. And we'll say, how can we explain the Trinity to people? I mean, there's people that claim to be Christians, oneness Pentecostals. They do not believe in God as described in the Bible. They believe in something called modalism, which is a heresy. It's been around for thousands of years. Not Christians. And then the biggest and most challenging topic, the problem of evil. And then we'll do that 14-week course of bibliology. I'm going to pack the highlights of that material into 1 hour of the survey of bibliology. And then we'll talk about objections of inerrancy and contradictions to the Bible, historical accounts, naturalism, our miracles. Can we believe in miracles in this world of science? As people like to, and then what was week 14 has expanded into all these topics on the right. So we're going to talk about why it's important for Christians to know that we're Christians, because there's no other worldview that actually gives us any confidence in knowing anything at all. And then we're going to move and we're going to talk about how should we think about, how should we proclaim the truth regarding abortion as Christians. What about feminism? There's at least 3 waves of feminism that have happened in the United States in particular. Some were good, others, the pendulum just kept going. And they went beyond normalcy, really, is what I can say. And then how does that apply to women in ministry? We talked about this some in the hermeneutics by breaking down 1 Timothy 2:11, but we're going to expand that topic into other ministry-type areas. What does Scripture say about women serving as singing and leading worship or leading different ministry items? What does it say about women as deacons? And when I say deacons, I don't mean deacons like the way we use the word deacon. I mean deacon is the way of somebody who was transporting a letter from Paul to the Romans, right? Somebody who was commissioned to do a task, to accomplish an act of service in the church. What does the Bible say about that? Then we're going to talk about war and this idea of just war. How should Christians think about that? Can a Christian soldier pick up a weapon and shoot at the enemy knowing that they could kill them? Isn't that taking a life? So how do we understand war as Christians? And then civil service and political involvement, since the government is given the power of the sword and we as Christians are told to turn the other cheek. How can you serve in the civil government or be involved in politics? And how should we as the church engage the political realm? So that will be a heavy topic as well. And what about gun control? This is a pretty hot topic lately. There's been a couple people that have asked me about, the Second Amendment and should you be allowed to own a machine gun, for example? And by a machine gun, the person asking didn't mean like a real machine gun like the military uses. What they meant was the toy machine guns that we sell at the gun shop that only shoot one bullet at a time. So you kind of get a sense of my opinion on it just from that statement. But I will say that's from knowing the difference as opposed to feeling like I'm doing something special with my AR-15 style toy gun. So the LGBTQ plus movement, also heavy in the news. How do we answer that as Christians? What's our position about the rightness and wrongness of that whole mindset, transgenderism, and how do we respond to people that are caught up in that movement, that really believe from their conscience because of what they've been taught in the world and the way that they feel that they're doing the right thing, that they're responding to their true self. So how do we engage that with the Word of God in a loving way? And then finally, what has been talked about, I think, more in the awareness of people's consciousness, this idea of critical theory or critical race theory or intersectionality. This is a political and legal movement that really came out of Marxism and has affected the way people think about interpersonal relationships, how we should teach children. It goes pretty deep. So how do we answer that, or how do we look at that as Christians, besides being angry about it, which is not helpful? So this should be the more exciting part of this course. So, but we have to lay a good foundation, and that's where we're at today. We're going to have several videos today because some of these topics are pretty heady, and having animation helps you kind of put it together. So they're not cartoons necessarily, but they are helpful videos to help make the point. So once again, just by way of review, and I forgot to take the silly animations out, 15 years ago, I think, or let's see, 28 years ago when I first taught this, that was still the style. So it's changed. So these are the different lines of evidential and experience-based arguments that we've made. And today, okay, wow, unbelievable. That's really quite annoying. Today, we're going to talk about presuppositional arguments. Anybody remember what a presupposition is? Well, we all know what assuming is, right? And don't share with me that, breakdown answer to that. It's where you don't have to have experience or knowledge. You just make an assumption about something and then kind of test your assumption. It doesn't require evidence beforehand. What you're actually doing is you're stating something that could or could not be true. You're presupposing this thing is true. And then you're going to go look at the evidence and see if the evidence lines up with what your presupposition is. This is the reverse of what we have done so far. Before, we looked at the evidence and we said, okay, based on all the evidence, what is the most likely theory of truth that puts that evidence together? That's called bottom-up reasoning sometimes, or inductive reasoning. This is deductive reasoning. This is the opposite. This is where we say, if this is true, then this must also be true. And if this is also true, then this next thing must be true. Let me put it in simpler terms. I'm going to presuppose that this imaginary jar is full of jelly beans. If it is full of jelly beans, then if I put my hand in and take something out, the thing that I take out will be, all right. And if they are jelly beans, then I can say the jar has jelly beans in it, right? My presupposition is true. It's absolutely true. It's irrevocably true. It may have other things in it, but at least we know there are jelly beans in it, right? So that deductive reasoning is a superior way of saying something is true, because if what you state and the connections between your lines of argument are logically true, then the outcome is invincible. It must be true. And there's two forms of presuppositional arguments we're going to look at. These are not all of them. These are just two good examples of them. So, a couple of video resources. Now, we looked at evidential experience-based arguments. Sometimes the Latin word for that is a posteriori, which means after you have experienced it. These are a priori reasoning. This is thinking about something before you have had the experience. And so we have a quick conversation here from Alvin Plantinga, who is, how about them apples, smart sort of guy. And he's going to explain why this idea of a priori, reasoning about something before you've experienced it, saying these are the tests or the evidences that have to be true as a consequence of what I'm going to state. So let's watch Alvin Plantinga cover that. Hello?
Alvin Plantinga is a leading American philosopher from the University of Notre Dame, where he is something of an institution, having been there since 1982. He is especially well known for his work in the philosophy of religion, and it's fair to say that Plantinga is one of the key reasons why we're experiencing a renaissance of interest in a philosophical defence of Christianity. His argument, made in the 1970s, that established that there is no logical inconsistency in believing in an all-powerful, loving God, despite the reality of suffering, was something of a turning point in philosophy. Plantinga has written numerous books, and people write books about him and his work. I was fortunate enough to meet him at Notre Dame, where we talked about God, Richard Dawkins, and personal faith. I began by asking him why he believes there is a God.
In my case, it's like asking, well, why do you believe there are other people? Or why do you believe there is a past? I can't give a proof that there's been a past or a proof that there are other people, just as I don't think the traditional arguments for God's existence, I don't think they are all that powerful, although they do have some force. But it just seems to me right. It seems to me that there really is such a person. When I contemplate, when I think about, or say when I look at the mountains, when I look at the treetops in my backyard, when I go to church, when I read the Bible, on many other occasions I just find myself convinced that there is such a person as God.
So there's a very deep sense of a personal experience of that reality for you.
Yeah, it's more like a personal experience than it is like an argument or like a philosophical proof or something of that sort.
There are plenty of increasingly wealthy authors who are willing to argue against God's existence. Do you see this as a last gasp of intellectual skepticism, or is it the renaissance of unbelief?
I don't think it's the last gasp of anything. Unbelief has been with us since the days of the Old Testament. The psalmist says, "The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God." So apparently there was atheism then, and there's been atheism, I guess, ever since. Of course, it rises and falls, and more or fewer people are involved in it. It's different in different parts of the world. So I don't think it's the last gasp of anything. I don't know if it's much of a renewal of anything either. It seems to me that current versions of atheism, a la the four horsemen of atheism, Dennett and Dawkins and Hitchens and what?
And Harris.
And Sam Harris. It seems to me their arguments are somewhat inferior to those of atheists maybe 50, 60 years ago.
So, based on what Alvin Plantinga was saying, this is an argument or a way of stating something where you're just observing the absolute best truth for what's around you, and it isn't necessarily a formal proof. It is a deductive reasoning for something. It is stating this thing is true, and if this is true, then the things that I experience would reveal that to me. So maybe it'll make more sense when we actually get into the statement of the argument. This comes from St. Anselm of Canterbury. He lived in the 1000s. Okay? Over 1,000 years ago, this dude was sitting in his little monkery chamber. I'm not sure, is this thing out? Yeah. Thinking about Psalm 12, and he was meditating on Psalm 12. And he starts thinking, how would I answer the fool? You know, what has to be true in the mind of the fool for him to state that there is no God? And he went down this path of meditating and thinking about this, and he came up with this deductive reasoning path. He's not trying to argue for the best explanation or highest probability that this is true, because there's always a chance that it wouldn't be true. The psalm says, the fool, the person without knowledge, without understanding, says that there is no God, which means that the evidence for God must be absolutely overwhelming. In fact, it should be so much so that you don't actually need evidence to know that it's true. See that extra step? It's not just, I'm so convinced by everything that I see. It's that I have to actually convince myself the opposite of it, because all the evidence in the world isn't enough to say for sure. But the psalm says it is for sure. So it has to be that the knowledge of God, the knowing of God, is necessary, not just possible. So how can you say that something is necessary and not just possible? And the way that you do that, and the way that Anselm did that, is he said, I can't make an inductive or abductive inferred reason. I can't say because I see all these things, the best explanation for it is that. He said, rather, this has to be deductive. If the things that I say are logically true, and the consequence of those truth statements say that God exists, then the only way I can say God doesn't exist is if I'm being foolish, if I'm violating logic itself, the absolute necessity of God. And so his statement that he said, actually he says it in two ways, but we're just going to look at one of them, is God is that being than which no greater being can be conceived. That being than which no greater being can be conceived. Anybody confused yet? Anybody understand that? People have been wrestling with this for 1,000 years about whether this, the best philosophers and thinkers in the world have been wrestling. Is this really a trick of logic, or is this really a logical proof? Let me show you a video that may help you break down what St. Anselm, and this is William Lane Craig's explanation. You guys are familiar with William Lane Craig. He's an apologist. He does a very good job and puts a lot of videos together. I might disagree with him about his Molinism, but that's a whole different topic than this. So let's look at what William Lane Craig has to say about the ontology. Is this in your way when we play the video? Okay, so let's take a look.
In the year 1078, a monk named Anselm of Canterbury astonished the world by arguing that if it is even possible that God exists, then it follows logically that God does exist. Anselm's argument came to be called the Ontological argument, and it has sharply divided philosophers ever since. The 19th century German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer called it a charming joke, but many prominent 20th century philosophers such as Charles Hartshorne, Norman Malcolm, and Alvin Plantinga think that it's sound. Here it is. God can be defined as a maximally great being. If something were greater than God, then that being would be God. And in order to be maximally great, a maximally great being would have to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect in every possible world. Possible worlds are simply ways the world could have been. To say that something exists in a possible world is just to say that if the world were that way, then the thing would have existed. For example, even though unicorns don't exist in the actual world, it seems at least possible that they could have. So we can say that unicorns exist in some possible world. On the other hand, a married bachelor does not exist in any possible world because the idea of a married bachelor is logically incoherent. It could not possibly exist. So if it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then we can say that he exists in some possible world. But wait, a maximally great being would not really be maximally great if it existed in only some possible worlds. To be maximally great, it has to be all-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect in every possible world. So think about it. If a maximally great being exists in any possible world, then it exists in every possible world. And if it exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. That is, a maximally great being actually exists. Thus, the atheist has to maintain not simply that God does not exist, but that it is impossible that God exists. Here's a summary of the ontological argument. Steps 2 through 6 are straightforward and largely uncontroversial. But what about point number 1? Clearly, if it can be shown that the idea of a God is logically incoherent, then the argument fails. But is the idea of a maximally great being absurd, like a married bachelor, or a square circle, or the smell of blue? This doesn't seem to be the case. The notion of an all-powerful, all-knowing, morally perfect being that exists in every possible world seems to be a perfectly coherent idea. But couldn't we parody this argument and make it work for anything? Why not say, it's logically possible that a maximally great pizza exists. Therefore, a maximally great pizza does exist? However, the idea of a maximally great pizza is not like the idea of a maximally great being. In the first place, there aren't intrinsic maximal values that make pizzas great. There could always be one more pepperoni to increase its greatness. It's not even obvious what properties make a pizza great. Thin crust or thick crust, extra cheese, anchovies? It's relative to the taste of the consumer. In the second place, a maximally great pizza would have to exist in every logical possible world. But that would mean that it couldn't be eaten. So it wouldn't really be a pizza. because a pizza is something you can eat. The idea of a maximally great pizza turns out not to be a coherent idea. The idea of God, on the other hand, is an intuitively coherent idea. Therefore, his existence is a possibility. And the ontological argument shows that if God possibly exists, then God actually exists.
Right? Deep. But the rabbit hole doesn't end there on the ontological argument. There is a form of this that was presented by Alvin Plantinga called the modal ontological argument, which is actually a stronger way of stating this idea from existence. If it's possible for a being to exist that is perfect in every way, has the properties of greatness to their maximum extent, if that's possible logically, then the next step saying that being would have to have being. Otherwise, it wouldn't be maximally great. Right? A being that's only in your mind is not as great as a being that actually exists, right? So if that being actually existing is greater than that being not existing, and the idea of a being that's maximally great is logically possible, then it's logically required, necessary, that that being actually exist. And this is what the modal argument is going to argue. So let's listen to
Alvin
William Lane Craig.
Plantinga's modal ontological argument
Craig,
is
talk
probably
about
the best argument for the existence of God. It uses the laws of modal logic and acts similar to a mathematical proof. This is probably why a lot of people have a hard time understanding it and simply dismiss it. There are many great videos on the internet right now that give a great analysis of the ontological argument. Yet many people ignore these videos because they find them too confusing. In this video, I'm going to try to articulate the argument in an easy way to understand. Because if you're a theist, then it's important to understand this argument because when understood correctly, it is impossible to refute. If you don't believe in a God, then it would probably be a good idea to understand it, so you don't appear foolish by misunderstanding it. To start, here's how the modal ontological argument works. Premise 1. It is possible that God exists. Premise 2. If it is possible that God exists, then God exists in some possible worlds. Premise 3. If God exists in some possible worlds, then God exists in all possible worlds. Premise 4. If God exists in all possible worlds, then God exists in the actual world. And premise 5. If God exists in the actual world, then God exists. Now, if you're like me when you first heard this, you're probably asking, well, wait, that doesn't make any sense. The logic of some of those premises doesn't add up. That's okay, because we're going to look at it closer so you can understand it. First, you should understand that when philosophers say a possible world, they mean a hypothetical situation. It is generally a way for philosophers to test an idea to see if it's logical by asking, could it exist in a possible world like ours? However, the one thing people seem to misunderstand the most in the argument is how God is defined. Some atheists say we're just imagining God into existence, like this clever bunch.
So here's my proof that a unicorn exists, and I actually wrote this passage. So let's define a unicorn as a magical equine being that has one horn and exists. By the above definition, such a being must exist. Therefore, a unicorn exists.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the ontological argument.
It's very hard to believe that there are people that use that. But there are.
The fact that the idea is there, that so I can believe that I'm green and polka dotted.
Apparently.
Okay.
As long
Yes, apparently.
So, okay, ladies and gentlemen, I am green with purple polka dots. And since I have stated that, therefore it must be true.
Since you can imagine
Yes.
it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, here's the problem. They are falling into the typical error of misunderstanding how God is defined. And because of their ignorance, they are concluding that the argument doesn't work. So we need to look at how God is actually defined and how it differs from how you would define a unicorn. Now, there are three ways to define a being or an entity in the ontological argument. An entity can either be impossible, which means it exists in no possible worlds, An example would be a square circle. An entity can be contingent, which means it exists in some possible worlds, like a unicorn. A unicorn could exist in some possible worlds, but not in others. Last, an entity can be necessary, which means it has to exist in all possible worlds. Now, what do we mean when we say something necessarily has to exist in all possible worlds? Well, examples of necessary entities are numbers, absolute truths, and shape definitions. For example, take the number 2. No one created it, it just exists necessarily. It can't not exist. Take a shape definition for another example, such as a square must have 4 sides. A square cannot exist with only 3 sides, because that would be logically incoherent in any possible world. So a necessary entity is something that cannot be false or fail to exist in any possible world. Therefore, necessarily, it has to exist in all possible worlds. So when we talk of God in this argument, we are saying that if he exists, he would have to be a necessary entity, because God is defined as a maximally great being. And a maximally great being is defined as a being that possesses all qualities that are better to have, which we define as great-making properties. Other examples are love, wisdom, and power. A maximally great being would also have to have these properties to their maximal extent. He would also possess no qualities that are bad to have, such as imperfection or corruption. These are defined as lesser-making properties. But most of all, he would have to possess the great-making property of necessity, because being necessary is a property that would be better to have. Now, looking back at the terms we defined earlier, if God was contingent, he wouldn't be maximally great, because he would only exist in some worlds, and would be less than great than if he existed in all worlds. Now, the idea of God being necessary is consistent with Scripture. Colossians 1:16 says, "For by him all things were created that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created through him and for him." So when skeptics try to debunk this argument by going through the premise with a unicorn in place of God, they are trying to define God in the same way you would define a contingent being. Whereas when we use God in the ontological argument, we are saying God is more than just contingent. He is maximally great, and anything maximally great must be a necessary entity, or it wouldn't be maximally great. So understanding how God is defined in the argument, let's go through the premises again. Premise 1. It is possible that God, a maximally great and necessary being, exists. Premise 2. If it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible worlds. Premise 3. If a maximally great being exists in some possible worlds, then a maximally great being exists in all possible worlds. Remember, if a maximally great being exists, then he has to be a necessary entity, because a contingent being cannot be maximally great. Premise 4. If a maximally great being exists in all possible worlds, then a maximally great being exists in the actual world, because the actual world is counted as one of the possible worlds. Premise 5. If a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then a maximally great being exists. And the conclusion is, a maximally great being exists. So does it feel convincing? Well, not really. But when it boils down, it's not a matter of how you feel. What matters is what is logically coherent. So hopefully now that you know how God is defined in the argument, you can understand how the ontological argument works. Are there objections to the argument? Yes, but only in premise 1, since the other premises just follow modal logic and are uncontroversial. The only way for skeptics to debunk this argument is to show that it is impossible for a maximally great being to exist. The most common way this is tried is with the omnipotence paradox. It is most commonly presented like this: can God create a stone so heavy that even he can't move? If God cannot create the stone, then he is not all-powerful. But if God can create the stone and can't move it, then he is still not all-powerful. Therefore, the idea of God is impossible. However, this attempt is debunked in the question itself as a logical absurdity. Asking can an omnipotent being create a stone so heavy even he can't move implies that omnipotence is defined as able to do the logically impossible, which is not consistent with the definition of omnipotence. No one who believes in omnipotent God believes God can do the logically impossible. The Bible has verses that state it's impossible for God to do certain things. Asking the question is like asking, can an omnipotent being create a square with 3 sides? Or can an omnipotent being tell you the shape of purple? Or can an omnipotent being tote an 11? It's just gibberish. All these questions are logically incoherent and cannot exist in any possible world, so you cannot expect them to be answered. Now you might be asking, Well, why can't God do the logically impossible? He is all-powerful, so he should be able to do anything. Well, you need to understand that logic derives from order. Without order, nothing makes sense, including existence. So you cannot use logical absurdities to disprove the existence of God. Because if logical absurdities were in a world along with God, then essentially nothing in that world could actually exist. So once again, you cannot use logical absurdities to disprove the existence of God, especially in modal logic. If one side uses logic to prove the existence of God, the other side cannot step outside of logic to disprove God. That'd be like a football game where one team gets to use machetes. This is why the omnipotence paradox is not accepted in academia as a valid argument. There are, of course, other objections to the argument. However, I'm not going to address them now, because this video is intended to be an introduction to the ontological argument, and I feel I've already overloaded your head with too much information. I cover the most popular objections to the argument in another video, which you can check out later. If this
All right, we're gonna skip the
Over the-
answering objections, arguments, because, well, we have a time limit, and there's one more that I want to talk about, which is the moral argument. Let me pause for questions about the ontological argument. I mean, it's impressive that a dude from the 11th century was thinking along this lines, right? Like, we tend to think of those dudes as like cavemen, right, wearing animal hides and trying to start fires with stones and, you know, dragging their wives home by the hair to their cave house or something. They weren't like that at all. They were very deep thinkers. Questions about the ontological, the argument from being. That being than which no greater being can exist. And if he really is that great, then he has to have existence. It's a logical necessity. So the only arguments against it are, is it possible for a maximally great being to exist? All right, so the moral arguments. These, we only have 4 slides to go, so it's okay. We're going to make it. These moral arguments consider the situation that we have universally accepted certain moral values as humans. There are some things as people that, regardless of the culture that you're in or how you were raised, if somebody does that, they're stepping outside of accepted morality. Which seems like, if you reflect on history, we have 6 million Jews that were killed in the Holocaust. They had horrible medical experiments conducted on them. Stalin made Hitler look like a preschool teacher. We were allies with that guy, right? And you think about some of the horrible things that have happened in history, and you say, is it really true that certain moral values were normative? So the argument from morality, the presupposition is, yes, because we went to war against those people to stop them and then brought them to trial. There's a 104-year-old man in Germany right now who's about to go to The Hague and be placed on trial for war crimes when he was a guard in a concentration camp in World War II. Because that crime was so horrendous that even though he's 104 years old, they're still going to bring him to trial because the need for justice is so strong, overwhelmingly strong within normative humanity. Okay? This is considered a priori. This argument is considered before experience, because you don't have to tell a baby that it's wrong to take something away from them. They know they have been committed an injustice when you steal their candy or whatever it is, right? They have this innate sense. When kids are on the playground and one kid pushes another kid down, they get upset about it. You don't have to teach them that. That's programmed into them. How do you answer this programmed morality? Things like fairness, human dignity, compassion. We don't have to learn. When you see, again, we're not talking about the sociopath. We're talking about the norms for humanity. When you see the puppy that the mother rejects starving to death because the mother won't feed that puppy, we don't laugh at that. We do everything we can if we know about it to try to, bottle feed that little puppy and make it live, because we have this sense of that would be an injustice, and that's just a dog, right? Not even a person. Yet we make it legal for abortion. Again, but we have to cover up the truth of what's going on to make that acceptable. We can't really look at what's happening and think that it's acceptable. Also showing the moral argument. And we'll talk about these things. The most popular advocate for it is, of course, C.S. Lewis. So, a couple of quotes, or actually a couple of misconceptions. This comes from C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity, page 65. There is a story about a schoolboy who was asked what he thought God was like. He replied that as far as he could make out, God was the sort of person who is always snooping around to see if anyone is enjoying himself and then trying to stop it. So, this is what some people conceive of as morality. What the Taliban thinks is morally right is not the same as what Western society thinks is morally right. Okay, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the fundamental directions for running the human machine to prevent a breakdown or a strain or a friction in the running of that machine. This is fundamental. So the argument from this, and I was supposed to grab my Apologetics book for the last 4 weeks because I was going to read something out of it for this, and I forgot it again. For objective morality is not arguing that we can have morals apart from being a believer. What that's saying is it isn't necessary for you to be a theist, a Jew, a Christian, a Muslim, a Unitarian, Universalist. You don't have to believe in something to have this basic morality. It exists outside of religion. It's not concerned with how people define the terms moral, good, right or wrong, or etc. It's not looking at what the definitions of those things are. It's just observing if it's true that there is a morality, then the consequence of it is that there is going to be the sameness or a standard that seems to exist everywhere. It is the justification or foundation for there being an objective morality. And it is under tremendous attack in our culture today. We live in a society that is really postmodern, but we can still look at the statement of postmodernism. This idea of postmodernism is that existence comes before essence. Let me break that statement down. You cannot state whether a thing is right or wrong before it comes into being. You have to look at what it is first. And then because that thing exists, there must be some rightness to it. If a person is born believing they're a woman, but they're actually a man, their existence is testimony enough that it is acceptable for that man to believe he's a woman and have surgeries done to dress in the culturally appropriate way for the other gender. Okay, existence precedes, comes before the essence, the nature of the thing. That is the viewpoint of postmodernism. It's not a correct viewpoint. It's just the way that they see it. They want to accept everything. And how far down can you go along that path before it becomes so morally objectionable to normative humanity that you can't continue it. Polygamy. Is that morally acceptable for societies? Cannibalism. What was the book with Soylent Green? 1984, I think it was. Is that sound familiar? Are you guys familiar with Soylent Green? That is a novel that was written about the dystopian view of the future. You know, things have gone horribly wrong. The government is in control of everything, and they're actually recycling people into food. That's called Soylent Green. Is that morally acceptable? To, you know, how far down can you go? There have been cultures where cannibalism, you know, was around. Typically, that didn't exist in cultures where there was a lot of food. Right? It happened in desperate sort of times. How about pedophilia? You know, how young can a person be before they can be given in marriage or just taken advantage of sexually before we are revolted across, regardless of what your belief system is? We all know intuitively there is a point where that is true. You get to a point when you just say, we cannot say we are human if we let this happen. That is what the moral argument is stating. There can be, you know, signposts along the way or varied degrees, but we all know there is a point where we just can't cross. Even the relativistic people say that it's oppressive to us if you proclaim Christ and the rightness and wrongness of the Bible. If you evangelize my children in school, you are oppressing my children because you're stating your viewpoint is morally superior to theirs. Well, what's the underlying thought process? That it's wrong to hurt their children by putting your viewpoint on them, right? See, there's this idea of a morality that exists, of a fairness or unfairness that is true. So, how does this go? If a personal God does not exist, meaning if there really is no God who cares and thinks about individual people, if that personal God does not exist, who has standards and expectations of his people, then there is no reason for there to be an objective moral reality. Because objective morality is built on the character and truth of God, the nature of God. And so if there is no God like that, then there is no objective morality. And then modus tollens, that's a Latin term that just is describing this deductive reasoning that we've been talking about. So, since objective moral values do exist, we know that they exist, that must mean that the opposite of non-existence is true and that a personal God does exist. So this is the basic argument. Because we know that moral arguments exist, that this statement right here is untrue and its opposite is true. Most moral arguments focus on disputing against relative morality. We're not talking about relative morality. You know, some cultures it's okay for 14-year-old girls to get married. Some 13. The Jewish law, the midrash, the explanation of what the law means says that a 12-year-old girl, as long as she has become a woman, is allowed to be married. That's their culture. But nobody says a 4-year-old should be given in marriage and you know, like normally, in a normative sense. There are sickos out there. I'm not talking about that. Objective morality says that, yes, the standards may move one way or the other, but the basic objective, the only way for that to be true is if there is a God. So, moving on. If there was no objective moral value, then what happens when you go to court and a person says what you've done to me was wrong? Your answer says who? What authority do you actually have? And there's two contradictory principles there that are in play. There is a complete transcendent, meaning above us, and immanent, meaning affecting us, set of statements about right and wrong. We find rules that are authoritative and clear and tell us how we can live righteously. There is a complete, covering every aspect of our lives, set of laws, rules, that is outside of us, but affects us, bears on us. They have authority and they're clear and they tell us about how to live righteously. But at the same time, we are completely free to choose for ourselves what we ought to do. But to decide for others as individuals and as a species what we ought to be. Meaning, I do have autonomy and self-rule about what I want to do. Maybe I want to walk up and drive off the road every person that does 65 and a 70, take away their license and not let them drive. Or that person that slows down on the on-ramp to get on the highway when there's 18-wheelers doing 70 miles an hour on the on-ramp, and they won't get above 55 until 4 miles down the highway. Maybe I want to just say they shouldn't get to drive. But objectively, and as a species, they've passed their tests, they've paid their car insurance, they've done their safety inspection, right? So I can't take my sense of morality or what I think is right and wrong and impose it on them. There must be a set of rules that transcends us individually and has bearing on us. And that cannot come simply from society. Otherwise, you just overthrow the society and make the one you want for yourself. Although that does seem to be the direction that a lot of people want to go. So that is the two arguments, the ontological argument and the moral argument. Because we can say if there was no personal God, there would not be objective morality. But there is objective morality, therefore there must be a personal God. And the consequence of there not being one would be absolute societal chaos. And guess what? When we reject God, what does it look like? Absolute societal chaos. Questions? Yes, Brother Billy. Yeah, what the claim would be is that evolution has taught people to have a sense of morality that works communally, what is best for the society. That because it's advantageous to the whole for individuals to act sacrificially or lovingly, that is why we have been programmed by evolution to be that way. It's absolutely not true. It's demonstrably, we can demonstrate that it's not true. There's something called the prisoner's dilemma, which was a psychological experiment that has been conducted and proven over and over again about the nature of people, where, so here's how it goes. You have person A and person B. They've both been charged with a crime. Person A testifies against person B. Person A only gets a 1-year sentence, but person B gets 5 years. Person B testifies against person A. Person B gets 1 year, person A gets 5. So the total sentence is 6 years if they testify against each other, right? Either way. If they both keep their mouth shut, each of them gets 2 years. So a total of 4 years time in prison, right? If they both testify at the same time, then they both get 5 years. So 10 total years. So what do you think happens over and over and over again when we run these prisoner dilemma experiments? 10 years every time. Nobody ever keeps their mouth shut. Even though it's advantageous for the society, for the whole, that they would only end up with 4 total years of prison time. They won't do it People refuse. And it's not just people, but we can do this on animals. They're the same way. There's nothing about evidence-based, if you're going to say the evidence of evolution shows this. Well, actually the evidence shows the opposite. Universally. And it doesn't matter if you're talking prison sentences, if you're talking rewards like food to dogs or something, they refuse to do what's best for the society and always try to do what's best for them to get the 1-year sentence, knowing the risk they could be getting 5. So that is the answer to that, is that they try to lean on something that has been disproven scientifically over and over and over again. But the fool says in his heart, there is no God. Any other questions? We will not be having this class next Sunday. Dawn will be having her surgery. So I will not be here for the morning service. That's also Communion Sunday. So we will be here. Thank you for your time. Done early.